Hello students, welcome back to our course on visual semantics for visual communication. In our last lecture, we talked about various steps of communication and we talked about how information is percolated step by step. Having said that, it is now we need to realize that there are various barriers of communication as well. So whenever communication is happening between two entities, there is a barrier which comes into, there are difficulties in communication which come into picture. So when you have a communication happening between two individuals or two groups, or an individual to a group, and the messages or the information is being conveyed or propagated, obviously there are chances that there could be various difficulties coming into picture, there could be various losses, there could be various communication gaps. We many a times talk about communication gaps. So let us try to understand and have an idea about what are the different barriers or limitations of communication as well. And if you see in this slide, the barriers are many, and that leads us to the fact that communication needs to be designed in a very, very prudent and practical manner. So the first barrier which comes into picture are the physical barriers. There are various physical barriers which come in terms of communication. Say physical or systems or ecological barrier. Say for example, you are trying to communicate with a person who is very far away, whom you can't see or interact with in person. So there could be some amount of barrier coming in terms of communication. So this is the most primary and basic barrier that we face in our day-to-day lives, and more so in our modern living, where human beings have been separated over geography, have been separated because of different commercial and work practices. Different needs of the day have led us to physical separation, and the physical barriers often come into picture, which is to a great extent has been mitigated by the technological advancements, no doubt. So coming to the other barriers, there could be system or ecology barrier, where the communication many a times happens in terms of system. There are a hierarchy of communication, or there is a particular method of communication. So or an organization, to give you an example, communication happens within an organization or a corporation or an institution in a particular system, in a particular structure, and there cannot be communication happening from any point to any point. There has to be a particular system, or there is a particular ecology within that organization for communication. So this many a times poses a communicational issue, and many organizations actually work towards communication design so that this communicational barrier could be reduced or modified, so that there are better employee satisfaction, or there is better communication happening, and there is no communication gap between different entities within that organization. So that is also a great barrier when it comes to communication. Now the next barrier to communication is an attitudinal barrier, or which is relating to individualistic barrier, where we have a individual approach or a hindrance towards communication. So there could be people, or there could be individuals who tend to communicate more, there could be individuals who tend not to communicate, and there could be individuals who tend to miscommunicate or mislead. As we talked in the last lecture, that in the very nature of information is to reduce ambiguousness, is to reduce uncertainty, and to predominantly help answering a question. So many times this attitudinal barrier becomes a conflict with the very intentions of information. So when there is a conflict at an individualistic level, at an attitudinal level, it could form a barrier. So we need to be educated enough to understand that communication problems may happen at this level as well. Many a times the barriers happen because of ambiguity of the messages itself, the words and phrases. For example, many a times we try to use a particular word which actually is meant for something else. Say for example, many a times in email communication we write this word as ASAP, as soon as possible, but the word, the ambiguity of that word and the intent of the social intent or the organizational intent, communicational intent of that word is many a times misleading. Many people look at ASAP as very derogatory. It means that as if you are trying to push, you are trying to force someone to act on it in a very fast possible manner. And for many other people actually take the essence of ASAP and feel the essence that it is urgently required or something like that and act towards it. So many a time the message that you are putting forward in form of some kind of word or phrase could be misleading to the receiver. There could be individual linguistic or communicational ability. So as we know, there are innumerous languages and dialects in the entire world, and many a times this individualistic linguistic ability may become a major barrier for various communities or various communication channels. Then there could be physiological barriers. Physiological barriers relates to various kinds of disability that are associated with people. Say for example, in terms of visual communication, the visual impairment or any kind of disability in terms of visual perception may lead to a physiological barrier in terms of that particular communicational mode. And though I am talking about various kind of barriers of communication in this particular slide, but we need to also understand that all these barriers, all these constraints actually frame the need to innovate on these particular areas, and that has actually happened over course of time, where lot of innovations both technologically, psychologically, physiologically, from various disciplinary standpoint, various innovations, various creative approaches have been taken to mitigate many of these problems. One of the example is the braille, formation of the braille, or when we are talking about computer interface, we talk about accessibility, where many a times for visually disabled people, the screen is being read out. What cannot be read as a text or an image, it is being read out, it is being communicated in an auditory fashion to a visually disabled person. So all these developments or advancements have happened only because people have understood these barriers and have worked towards mitigating these barriers. So that is a very, very essential area which we need to understand and learn about. That is why I am spending some time on making you understand about the barriers of communication. So now if we look at the next level of barrier, which is the technological multitasking and absorbency and criticism and low confidence. These two are very, very important from a modern standpoint, or from sociological interaction standpoint that we are going through in this particular era. We are bombarded with technological advancements, we are bombarded with media, we are bombarded with handheld gadgets and utilities, and all of these have lot of information, lot of communication percolating to us all the time, and which leads to absorbency of that. Many a times two things tend to happen. Many a times we miss out on certain things and we fail to respond to certain communicational needs in a certain manner, and second, we are many a times responding in a manner where the true information is not percolated. We are taking a quick action because of the absorbency, because of the multitasking we are associated with. So we are taking a quick stand on some kind of information, and hence the communication is lost. As we talked about during this course of propagation, this encoding and decoding, structuring of a message, you need to pay attention. You need to spend some time in restructuring of these structuring and restructuring of these messages. That fails, or that is reduced to a great extent in many of the cases. So that leads to this kind of ambiguity many a times. And also the fear of criticism, or many a times fear, the lack of confidence in communication also leads to a barrier, which is many a times we are all very socially visible in today's world. So many a times we fear criticism, many a times we fear communicating a particular information with the fear that this could affect the social status of that particular individual, or there could be various other factors for that matter. But the idea here is there is a fear for communication, there is a fear for information percolation in many cases, and which leads to a barrier in many a times. And there could be other forms of barriers, which could be different gender, community and discriminatory barriers. So individuals feeling a part of a particular discriminated group may often lead to some kind of communication barrier. They might not be communicating or informing certain things which otherwise would have happened. And as I talked about earlier, this earlier as well, many a times there are communicators who tend to bypass certain information, and many a times there are communicators who tend to mislead, or it is not intentional in most of the cases. It is only owing to the fact that you really do not have sufficient information, or you really do not have the data and knowledge, or clubbing the data with the knowledge together, and thus you start percolating the immature or the half developed information, which can lead to a lot of misunderstanding. So there could be a bypassing where you are actually not informing, or you are not letting out some communication to happen, or it could be other way also, where you are letting out some information which are not really required and which could be misleading. So these are in short all the barriers which are prevalent in communication. There could be many, there could be combination of these barriers happening in a particular situation, in a particular case, and these barriers need to be sorted out. Otherwise the information communication will always have a point where it lacks, or it will always have a limited conveyance to the different users it is catering to. So now let us again go back to our bicycle story. I am very fond of this bicycle story. Many a times we talk about the aspect that communication is very culturally biased, or it is dependent on culture to a great extent, and it is related to cultural aspects. No wonder it is. It is very important to understand a particular culture when we are talking about communication or information percolation within that culture or cross culture. But the question is how and why culture is so important, and what is the role of culture, how does it play in the entire arena of information and communication. So again, going back to that bicycle story, this holds the key why cultural aspect is very important, because first the context we talked about relates to a particular culture. The base, the need for communication, the very setup why we are communicating at in first place is relating to a context. You know, I told about me and my friend and I having noticed this bicycle. Say for example, this was happening in a different culture where actually you tend not to point things or not to show a particular object to a particular individual. Maybe there is a culture which exists where you don't point or show a particular object to your friend. In that particular context, the whole premise of communication would have been very difficult. I wouldn't have pointed to that bicycle for that matter. Or maybe let's take another example, where is a cultural association, say a bicycle, or in this case it is a bicycle, say an object should not be pointed because it has some kind of socio-religious connotation. So in that particular case, I would never point and show that bicycle to my friend. Just giving you a rough example to understand. So this set of context is definitely and very, very strongly related to the cultural aspects. Now let us look at the next thing we talked about. The next thing we talked about is the experiences that we have. Since our childhood, our experiences are rooted to the society where we have grown up, is rooted to the culture where our parents, family and friends belong to, the kind of schools we have visited to, the kind of education that we have received. So all of this form, or all of this fall under a particular cultural impetus. It falls under some kind of cultural setup, cultural mechanism, cultural ecology, within which all of these things are happening since our childhood. So definitely the second aspect as well, all our experiences are very, very rooted to the culture. So as you can understand, the context is related to culture, the experiences are related to culture, or exposure to different cultures. So these two form the very strong basis why our communication, our information, the way we behave and act, the way we percolate information, the way we communicate with each other is related to culture. Now coming to the third aspect which we talked about, which was the assumptions that I am making, which are the human aspects of communication we talked about, where we are trying to share, we are trying to help another person, assuming certain things, assuming some better situations in the first place. So these assumptions definitely are rooted to culture. We talked about values when we talked about assumptions. So it has its basis based on values, and then values are based on the cultural premise that you have. So if we look at now context, experiences and assumptions, all three are very closely knit with culture. They evolve with culture, they evolve with kind of setup that you as an individual grow up, that I as an individual grow up, perhaps a group or a community or an organization as a whole has evolved. So it is very, very dependent on that. And looking at today's context, when we are living in a world where cultures melt with each other, we live in a world where the cultures cross and interact with each other, this is even very, very important to understand where we are going international, where we are going global, and where we are going local, where we are going very rooted to the culture, and where we are falling flat. So probably understanding the context, experiences and assumptions in a case to case manner would help us dissect and understand this better. Now if we move on to the next aspect of communication, which is happening in two different modes or components. So communication has two different communication component. One is the verbal component and the other is the non-verbal component. So we have learned that there are communication which takes place in terms of language, which is the most prevalent and the most common form of communication as soon as we talk of communication. But we should also understand that there are innumerous ways of communicating non-verbally as well. And what are those ways of communicating non-verbally? First is the paralinguistics. Paralinguistics is the tone or the pitch or the vocal modulation that I have in my voice. So that also leads to a particular kind of communication. So that deals with paralinguistics, where we are actually talking about the modality, the sound quality of communication. So that also plays a very, very important role in communication. The other is the proxemics. So in case of architecture, interior design, or even when it comes to sociology, proxemics plays a very, very important role in terms of non-verbal communication. It relates to the spaces. So whenever we are in a social domain, we are actually in proximity or we are in a distance. So there is a physical distance, and that relates to proxemics. So many a times we talk about a personal bubble. So each one of us is having a personal bubble around it, and the bubble is roughly the arm's distance. So if we have our arms straightened out, if we draw a sphere around this arm straightened out, that is the personal bubble we talk about. And the communication within the personal bubble which happens is very different from the communication which happens beyond the personal bubble or further. So there are differences between these proxemics, the distance from you as a communicator or a receiver. So that also plays a very, very important role in terms of non-verbal communication. Then there are other aspects of communication which are various artifacts, which are the dress code or the accessories. They also lead to various kind of communication and modalities of non-verbal communication. Then there is chronemics, which is the time aspect of communication. So whenever we are communicating verbally, whenever we are communicating in other means, by other means also, it is in reference to time. It is in reference to a particular sequence in space and time, which is very, very interesting aspect to look at, that communication has a time aspect inherent with it, and that also forms as a non-verbal mode of communication. So while I am speaking, I am communicating this particular lecture, you can see that I am having this tonal variation. I am making these tonal variations which is in the domain of paralinguistics. I am making this gestural movement which are in the proxemics aspect. I am wearing certain kind of attire, I have certain kind of accessories, that is also communicating to you in a certain manner in forms of artifact. And then there is chronemics, where I am using a pause. Many a times I am speaking fast, many a times I am speaking slow. There is a break within these lectures. So all of these together is forming a non-verbal mode of communication, which is chronemics. But that is also a very, very crucial aspect of communication, as you can understand. And then there is kinesics, which I talked about, which relates to the gesture. So this relates to the gesture. And last but not the least is the visual, which is the domain that we try to work on. Before we move on to the visual domain, this is the reason why I am giving you the idea of the entire horizon of communication and information, and within that, visual aspect is one part of it. It is very, very essential, no doubt. We are communicating visually all the time, but the aspect of visual communication needs to be considered as part of a bigger whole, as part of a bigger domain, and this gives an idea to that. So moving on with the theme of our lecture today, we are talking about media as such in playing a role in the communication. So if we refer back to our earlier diagram, where we have shown this act of propagation and conveying, just like sound cannot propagate without a medium. Sound requires a medium for its propagation. Similarly, communication or conveyance and propagation of ideas and information needs a media, needs a background, needs the basis based on which this works out. So we talked about signals. So these signals are triggered in form of certain kind of media packages. The form of media could be varied, the form of media could be multiple, combination, singular, but all of it together helps in communication and propagation of this information. So the channel of communication could be many. The channel of communication could be visual, the channel of communication could be auditory, sound, the channel of communication could be tactile. For people with visual disability, they use braille. So the communication can happen by your tactile interface also. It could be haptic, where it relates to movement and touching. It could be olfactory also to some extent. It could be kinesics, where the movement and where you are, the position of a particular individual plays a role. It could be electromagnetic, biochemical, and last but not the least is the abstract languages. Human beings have developed this innumerous number of languages, and which is so fascinating, something which is very abstract yet forms the basis of communication. And so is visual communication, which is very basic yet needs an understanding for it to be percolated, for it to move from one to another without a loss, without a failure in terms of comprehension and analysis, so that the action could be taken properly at the receiver's end. If you remember the model of communication we talked about in our last class, so if you look at, if we refer back to this particular diagram, so from the communicator to the receiver, and this goes in this direction, and the last bit of the diagram was taking an action. So the receiver needs to take an action which is intended. So the action has to be in line with the intent of the communicator. So in order to get the action right and get it work, we need to make sure that the channels of communications are properly done and it is properly communicated. So now coming to media helping us in terms of communication. Media is basically a tool to store and deliver information. The diagram actually give an understanding of that we work in a setup of media in order to propagate, and it acts as a tool. It helps us to store, to propagate, to communicate this information and deliver this information. So media could be bifurcated into two particular aspects. One could be a communication media and another could be a mass media. So we all are aware of mass media, which is newspaper, television, and many other forms of media in today's world of digital media. So there are various mass communication which is happening, which is communication happening all at a sudden for a mass, or it could be in smaller chunk in a communication media meant for a particular set of users or meant for a particular audience. So it can bifurcate into these two aspects of a media. And then if you look at both of these aspects are related to the developments in the technology. So if you look at the development of communication media as such or development of mass media as such, it has always been in line, or it has always evolved with the course of development of the technology. So at one point of time, human beings used clay palettes, papyrus for putting down their thoughts. Before that, it was Shruti. It was based on learning by listening. There was no other mode of documenting it. That was the communication media at that particular point of time. Then with the advent of technology, with the advent of development of newer materials, it moved on to writing. And then we moved on with printing press, with different channels of communication, ink, photography, cinematography, development of digital media coming into picture, and then in today's world, propagation of media as well by World Wide Web and other channels created a technological evolution from time to time, and based on that, these two communication media and mass media has also kept on evolving, keeping in mind the technological advancement. So that brings us to the end of this particular lecture series, which is talking about information, communication and media. In our next lecture, we will start talking about visual perception and visual communication. Thank you.